You know, when you drive from Halifax to Wolfville, one of the things you see in the distance on a clear day are the cliffs of Blomidon. They beckon as a place to camp, to explore, and of course to hike. Now, even getting here is a beautiful journey as you go by dikelands, farmers' fields, and so many other areas where there are spectacular views. Well, today I'm here hiking at Blomidon Provincial Park on my way to the Blomidon Lookout on today's Walkabout. There are many trails here. Today I'm headed out from the campground, first on the Woodland Trail before reaching the Lookoff Trail, and then following the cliff back along the Upper Jodrey Trail. Of course, there are many other routes you could choose. The Lower Jodrey Trail brings you from further back into the campground. It's a steeper trail leaving from the park entrance. The Borden Brook Trail follows a route away from the cliff, past some small waterfalls, and away from the official camping areas. Well, on my right is the Wilcox Trail. Now, the Wilcox Trail is an interpretive trail. It's a series of stacked loops running for about 1.5 kilometers. I'm continuing on the Woodland Trail, which will take me 2 kilometers to another trail, the Lookoff Trail, which, as you might imagine, takes me to a spectacular lookoff overlooking the Minas Basin. Now, the cliffs of Blomidon, well, of course, this didn't happen overnight. In fact, it took 225 million years of erosion, glaciation, and volcanic activity. While the Cape now sees significant erosion from the oceans and weather, the geology of this area actually exists because it escaped erosion by rivers and glaciers, which carved out the Annapolis and Cornwallis valleys. A roughly 200-kilometer ridge of basaltic lava runs from Briar Island all the way to Blomidon. And that's what has left this area with such a rugged profile, which is quite different from the farm fields and dikelands only a few kilometers away on the valley floor. Well, this is Ells Brook, and this runs all the way across Cape Blomidon to Scotts Bay on the other side. Now, Scotts Bay would be well known if you've hiked Cape Split. You have to drive right by it. And it's where the sawmills of Cape Blomidon were mostly built. And in fact, the very first mill to be built on the Cape was built by Thomas Andrew in 1783, right along Ells Brook. Over the next few hundred years, there would be mills built all throughout Scotts Bay, including 3 right along this watercourse. And one of those was the very last water-powered mill to be built on Cape Blomidon. And that was built by Ardent Tupper, and they made barrel stock and shingles. This side of Cape Blomidon is dominated by a diverse mixture of trees, very indicative of a traditional Acadian forest. Sugar maple, yellow birch, and beech make up the hardwoods, while white spruce and balsam fir comprise most of the softwoods. These forests, which saw small-scale forestry and farming operations but never saw significant development, are home to a diverse array of animals and plants. Hawks, eagles, and other birds of prey are found soaring over the trees, while plover and other seabirds are found along the shore. White-tailed deer, along with many small species of animal, are common here. Lichens, mosses, and Arctic alpine plants are seen clinging on cliff faces and trees and hiding in the forest in the crevices of rocks and along streams. So, of course, the first people to live on this land and truly take advantage of the diversity here were the Mi'kmaq. Now, one of the most important figures in the Wabanaki culture, of which the Mi'kmaq were part of, was Glooscap. Glooscap First Nation is, in fact, not that far from here. And in Mi'kmaq lore, Glooscap is said to have created the Annapolis Valley, and Cape Blomidon was his home. These days, the name Glooscap is used to adorn trails, highways, businesses, schools. There was even a locomotive that went by the name Glooscap. Well, this is called Indian Springs, and as long as I safely get across this water course, I will be leaving the Woodland Trail and joining the short look-off trail as I head out to Minas Basin. Now, I actually haven't been that far from the Minas Basin this entire hike as I worked my way through the forest. Minas Basin itself gets its name from a mispronunciation. Samuel de Champlain called this Le Bassin des Mines, referring to the mineral deposits here, but the English heard it as Minas Basin. The Mi'kmaq were, of course, the first people to settle in the area around Minas Basin, and European explorers arrived in this area around the 1600s. These days, to travel between the northern and southern sides of the basin, you actually have to drive around via Truro. But for more than 200 years, right up to 1941, a series of ferries crossed the basin, with the last one connecting Parsborough, Wolfville, and Kingsport. That ferry was called the MV Kippawo, which was a made-up name created by combining the three community names. At the end of the look-off trail, you come to the farthest point on the trails that are actually maintained in Blomidon Provincial Park. And I'm looking out over the Minas Basin now. On a beautiful, calm day like today, it's a little hard to imagine just how powerful those tides can be. And in fact, they are so powerful, and they rise so high, 50 feet at times, that it's very hard for plants and animals to survive here. There is a small group of animals that can survive, and they can manage to withstand the power of the waves and the tides. And for plants, again, it's a small number of plants that actually survive here, because it's hard for seaweeds to grab hold of the clays and the rocks on the bottom when those tides are just ripping in and out, combined with the turbidity of the water, which makes it hard for light to reach the bottom. This is the second of the look-offs on the look-off trail, and as I head back on my hike, I'll be going along the Upper Jodrey Trail, where there are many more look-offs, and you can be sure I'll be stopping at them all. That's after the break. I'm in Blomidon Provincial Park, and just before the break, I reached the end of the look-off trail and the end of the maintained trails here. I'm headed back along the cliffside of Blomidon on my way to the Upper Jodrey Trail. This cairn in the park recognizes Roy Jodrey. Roy Jodrey donated 400 acres just before his passing to the creation of Blomidon Provincial Park. These days, the Upper and Lower Jodrey Trail have the most spectacular views here. Somehow that seems appropriate. Roy Jodrey was the son of a sawmill operator and carpenter from nearby Gaspereau. At the age of 12, he took on his first job as an apple harvester. In 1910, at the age of 21, he crossed the Atlantic on White Star Line's RMS Adriatic in search of business contacts. By this point, he had already had a business for 3 years shipping apples from the Gaspereau Valley to Europe and wanted investors to expand his operations. Well, 10 years later, at the age of 31, Jodrey found a partner, and he created a hydro dam and a pulp mill on the Gaspereau River. With that, he created the Gaspereau River Light, Heat, and Power Company, and he brought electricity to the entire Gaspereau Valley. After that, well, he wasn't stopping there. He went on to create the Avon River Power Company and the Minas Basin Paper and Pulp Mills Company. Then came the Great Depression. Now, you might think that all hope would be lost, and it almost was. Just before it hit, Jodrey lost his business partner, and the Depression itself sent Jodrey spiraling into debt as the money he had made selling off hydroelectric assets to Nova Scotia Light and Power crashed in the stock market. But Jodrey went to Montreal and arranged new financing, not to cover his losses, but to expand. He built a new hydroelectric plant on the St. Croix River and a transmission line to supply his pulp mill in Hantsport. By the time it was completed, it was 1935, and another new venture of his, Canadian Keys Fibre, or CKF, had opened to produce paper plates. You may never have heard of CKF, but you've probably heard of their brand, Royal Chinette. Royal Chinette is said to be Canada's leading premium paper plate brand. CKF still exists today. They not only make that product, but they also make things like paper takeout containers and egg cartons. And CKF, well, they're still headquartered in Hantsport, where it all began, and they have operations across the country. The efforts of Roy Jodrey were ultimately rolled up into a holding company called Scotian Investments, which continues to have investments in the energy industry, as well as paper products and medical diagnostics, and at one time even had a large stake in Highliner Foods. Roy's descendants are represented on the board of a company which started from humble beginnings in 1927 and now has over 1,500 employees across North America. Blomidon Provincial Park was created in 1970 and comprises about 1,900 acres of land. Roy Jodrey and his family were fairly instrumental in the creation of this park, but this wasn't the only land that they owned on Cape Blomidon. Cape Split, which is on the other side just above Scotts Bay, was also in the Jodrey family from about 1920. The province acquired that land in 2002. By the time Jodrey passed away in 1973, the grade school dropout was a director of almost 60 companies and had created a financial and business empire which remains to this day. Interestingly, unlike many other maritime companies like the Sobeys, Irving, and McCain, not a single one of the companies Jodrey created or acquired took the family name. So behind me here through the woods is the Blomidon vernal pool. Now, I have actually seen many vernal pools on my hikes around Nova Scotia, although rarely ones with this much water in them, so that's kind of neat. Now, you may have heard of the different myths and legends of fairies that live in the forests, and maybe even sometimes seen a fairy door. Well, I'll tell you a secret. There are real fairies that live in this pool. Anastraca, or fairy shrimp, are one of the 4 orders of crustaceans in the class of animals called Brachiopoda. They live in all kinds of unusual places, from vernal pools to the Antarctic ice, and even in deserts. They look just how you would expect shrimp to look, but they are small, only between 6 and 25 millimeters in length. Depending on how old you are, you may remember the advertisements that used to appear in comic books for sea monkeys. Now, sea monkeys were a type of brine shrimp, and fairy shrimp, well, they are also a type of brine shrimp. These vernal pools are really just shallow wetlands that have no particular entrance or exit for water. Sometimes they dry out completely, and often you can't see water on the surface. But especially when wet, this type of pool is a critical habitat for frogs, salamanders, insects, and fairy shrimp. As you might expect, they're also critical drinking sites for a whole range of birds, mammals, and amphibians. It isn't too often that you see they have created selfie spots, and of course they have created selfie spots next to the fairy pond. So one of the things about the trail at this point, since I've passed the vernal pool, is although I'm walking very close to the coast, I actually don't see it. I don't see those cliffs. This trail is in somewhat from the edge, and the reason for that is because what gives those cliffs such a dramatic look, the erosion, is the same thing that would make it very dangerous to have the trail along it. So as I reach the end of the Upper Jodrey Trail, I've actually come back to the campground that I started in. Now this trail is accessible year-round, and it's a different experience depending on what time of year you would do it. Of course, you have to be much more careful in winter because the park is unmonitored at that time of year. Now, despite the maintained trails being on this end of the park, that doesn't mean you can't hike the upper end of Blomidon Park. After the break, I'll be following an old forestry road, hiking into Upper Blomidon. When hiking Blomidon Provincial Park, most people will choose to enter from the campground at the main entrance and use the well-maintained trails there. But that isn't the only way to experience the park and the history of the area. The Rogers Road Trail starts in Scotts Bay and it crosses the Cape and lands just above the Upper Jodrey Trail. And that's where I'm on my walkabout today. The first part of Rogers Road is still an active road, and it is named for James Rogers and his family. This was literally the road that led to his farm and a sawmill he operated on a brook here. The James M. Rogers sawmill is long gone, though remains can be found in the area. And the memory of it survives in the community. In fact, the Rogers home itself, built around 1857, has been continuously owned and occupied by the Rogers family. Forestry was one of the first industries to take hold when European settlers arrived in Scotts Bay, and over the years, there were 17 sawmills in this community. Of course, not all at once. This road would have been used not only for accessing different parts of the farm, but also to access the forests of Cape Blomidon, to bring lumber in for those mills. You may recall that the first written account of a sawmill in Scotts Bay was the Thomas Andrew Mill in 1783. These were, of course, the days before electricity, and so water power, by way of streams, ran the saw blades and the grist mills. That meant, of course, these were all seasonal operations. By the early 1880s, or perhaps the late 1870s, the first steam-powered mill arrived in Scotts Bay, allowing year-round operations. The David Jess sawmill was said to have been a large mill, with not only the single blades of the simple water-powered mills, but with planers, edgers, and other equipment. There is a lot of speculation in the historical record about the purpose of the mills and how far that went beyond simply constructing farms and homes. That was important, of course, but it's believed that many of these mills, especially the larger steam ones, would have been involved in the export of lumber and making planks for the shipbuilding industry. These logs are almost certainly remnants of some forestry work in this area. They're very cleanly cut. Now that might surprise you since you've only heard me talk about the 1800s, but the last steam-powered mill in this area was the Cyrus Steel sawmill, and that was located, a kilometer or so from where I started this hike. It opened in the 1940s, but it operated right until 1972. And then right around 1972, the Elmer Tupper Mill opened up, and that operated right until the 1980s. So it's completely reasonable that some of these logs could be from that milling operation. It's one thing to build sawmills and live in the forests you're harvesting. It's an entirely different thing to get your product to market. In areas with large rivers, loggers would have floated logs to mills and then used some of the same rivers to transport the cut logs to market. Scotts Bay has no such rivers, so roads like this one had to be built both to access the forests and reach customers. Hiking can be great exercise, of course, gets you out in the outdoors, but can you imagine what it would have been like doing forestry in these woods before the days of significant industrialization? Well, somebody has imagined that. In 1979, a book was published entitled Old Boy, Have You Had Enough Pie? A social history of food in the logging camps. And in that book, they estimate that the young men and the boys who would have worked in these camps would have burned about 4,000 to 9,000 calories a day, hauling lumber, cutting logs, That is a lot of calories. Of course, it was also a lot of work. So as you come along the trail, with the exception of some new growth that's coming up, it's sometimes hard to believe that this area was once heavily logged, but then you come upon things like this, which are almost certainly remnants of an old forestry camp in the woods. I've just crossed into the northern end of Blomidon Provincial Park along the Rogers Road Trail. Now, there is both archaeological and ecological evidence to support why the loggers would have set up camp on this side of Cape Blomidon. This is where the hardwoods were located. And of course, there were softwoods too, but it was the hardwoods that they wanted for their mills. That was the highest value. Of course, the mills had to be located on the Scots Bay side, where I started my hike, because that's where it was easier access to the shore. And for mills that were doing export, they would load the lumber onto barges, and then it would be shipped from there over to Parsboro on the other side of Minas Basin. You couldn't do that on this side, because of course, this side of Cape Blomidon is sheer cliffs right down to the water. The people who worked in the forests of Cape Blomidon were rarely just loggers. They were farmers, they were fishermen, sawmill and gristmill operators. These were often groups of extended family members working together. Logging was more about extra income for most in this area. This is the end of the Rogers Road Trail. I literally can't go any further than here because that is a cliff that goes straight down to the Minas Basin. There's a beach there at the moment because the tide is out. And this is why they couldn't build the sawmills over here, because if they did that, they would have no way to load the lumber on barges and take it around the Cape and over to Parsboro. And in the distance, I can actually see Parsboro, just make out the harbor on a day like today. And that's where it would be used in the shipbuilding industry or sent away for export. Of course, the Europeans would take up forestry when they settled here because they needed the lumber to build their homes, their farms, and their businesses. As French writer François-René Chateaubriand once said, forests are the first temple of divinity, and it is in the forest that man first grasped the idea of architecture. If your next walkabout finds you in the forest, I hope it inspires you in the same way it inspired the first European settlers in this place.
Hey, come on, feel the sunshine.